Thank you very much for inviting me, Emma. So this the Wage and Employment Dynamics project is funded by ADR UK and the ESRC. It's a collaboration between University of the West of England in Bristol, City University, National Institute of Economic and Social Research, and UCL in London. So the idea behind this has been a very long time coming. It started some years ago, but we had an idea that thinking, suppose you got a person, an individual, and you had some personal characteristics on that individual, and you had some information about their wages and the hours they work and the industry and location, and you also had some information about the other forms of income they have, whether they're on pensions, child support, universal credit. Well, what happens if we also had that information about the person going back over several years? What happens if we also knew about where they work? We knew about their family relationships, and we knew this for the entire population. This would be fantastic. We could do loads of stuff. We could think about wage progression. You know, what happens to people's wages over time? How do people get out of low pay? The impact of universal credit benefit reform, labour market equality, distributional impacts, education choices, returns to education, local labour markets, commuting patterns, impact of tax regulation, careers of ex-service personnel, household income decisions, retirement decisions. It just goes on and on. There's so much information that we could get out of something like this, which would be relevant to all central government departments, devolved governments, and a lot of local authorities as well, in terms of understanding what is in their local labour market. The good thing is that this data does all exist. The bad thing, it's not all in one place. So, for example, ONS in the annual survey of hours and earnings has really good information on wages, hours, the type of organisation someone's working for, and it's got longitudinal data going back up to 40 years. ONS also has more information about the businesses. DWP has lots of information about non-employment income, and also personal characteristics and family characteristics. HMRC has information on organisations, so you can look at self-employment as opposed to employment. It's got lots of wage information. It's got the entire population in there, so we could look at fairly robust estimates of impacts across the entire country. HISA or education data would tell us an awful lot more about individuals' characteristics. So that would allow us to link in things like the impact of going to university based upon all sorts of different factors on your work outcomes. And finally, the census information would have information on the entire population, on family relationships, and detailed personal characteristics. So all of that's there. It'd be fantastic if we could get this all in one place, because that would clearly be a major strategic asset. And we think we can build a sustainable framework for this. We can't do it quickly. We can do it very slowly, but we think, you know, given the way that data is being made available in here, given the infrastructure for sharing data, particularly the Secure Research Service, given the legal changes that allowed more access to data, and given the potential for funding from the SRC, then maybe we can do this, but we're going to need to do this quite slowly. So where we got to so far is the initial phase of this is we are linking information which essentially is under ASH's control, ONS's control. So that's the annual survey of hours and earnings, census data, and the ONS business register. Now, it might seem odd to say, why are we looking at something like the annual survey of hours and earnings, which has been studied for many, many years and by a very large number of researchers? Well, what we're doing is we're going back to the raw data underlying that, and we're QAing it, quality assuring it, from a research perspective. And that in itself has thrown up a large number of interesting challenges and new information about the data. Because what we wanted to do is provide a rock solid core data set, which will then be linkable to the other data sets. And to do that, we need to make sure that we know everything that's in that data and can explain why all the variables have the values that they should have. We are in the process, or ONS is in the process of linking that to Census 2011 data. Obviously, we can't directly get access to do the linking because we only work with de-identified data. That is imminently arriving in the lab, and that will allow us to fill in the first gap with the data, which is that the ONS information doesn't have very much information on personal characteristics. Census will allow us to acquire that information, and because ASH is longitudinal, even though we're only linking the census from 2011, that allows us to look at people before and after the 2011 period. What have we done so far? Well, we're only at the very early stages of the research period, but I'll just show you a couple of graphs, the sort of things which we're currently up to with our first results coming out. This is looking at the jobs paid at the minimum wage, below the minimum wage, and in the low paid segment. Now, low paid is defined as individuals working below 2/3 of the median salary. And what you can see on here is what appears to be a good news story, is that the number of low paid people are falling dramatically over time. This is part of the Low Pay Commission strategy, which is to make sure that the minimum wage gets to 2/3 of median wages. So it's not surprising. We would expect to see the number of low paid falling and more people falling into the minimum wage category. And we can see this quite dramatically if we look at the second graph I'm going to put up. This in 2004 shows the distribution of earnings around the minimum wage. You can see a spike on at the minimum wage. There's a first spike of the minimum wage. There are a small number of people being paid below the minimum wage. Then there's a range of people being paid at various 5 pence sections above the minimum wage. There's another big jump at the end of the graph. That's where people are being paid £5 an hour, which is a very popular wage to be paid. We move forward 8 years and we find that there's a lot more people being paid at the national minimum wage. Right? So, I mean, they are being paid more and they will have had a pay increase, which is above the general rate of wage increase. But there's a lot more people clustered at the minimum wage 8 years later. And we move on another 7 years, the latest data we have. And the concentration of workers at the minimum wage is even higher. So we can use this information to try and understand these systemic shifts in the labour market, as well as, because we have a very large number of observations in here, we can break this down into very many different ways and different characteristics. So where we're going next is we're currently in discussions with HMRC about acquiring some of the PAYE self-assessment data, because the problem with ASH is that we don't quite know what people who are working are doing when in between the time that they're surveyed. So they're surveyed in April. We don't know what happens from April to April. And if they don't appear in the April survey, we don't know if they're not being surveyed or if they're not working. So this will fill in the gaps, the ONS data. This will be really important as well for quality assuring the ONS data. This will also allow us to look at, in a small way, at income and self-employment switching and some element of family income choices. We also have had some discussions, although they're under lower priority at the moment, about education data, because again, looking at the ASH's longitudinal characteristics, we can identify people's longitudinal educational characteristics and then the longitudinal work characteristics. So potentially this is very important. In the far distant future, DWP data would fill in another very large gap in the data about what's happening for people who are not working. But at the moment, this is in the far horizon.